Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. And as I discussed, my work is a little easier than the presenters. And from their presentations, I have some 3 points I would like to make. And the first point is about the cooperation or collaboration between the two countries, China and the United States. And because this morning we listened to the panel about maritime security, and also we listened to the panel of cybersecurity. But in comparison of these previous panels, and it seemed to me, and also clear to everybody, that the cooperation between the two countries in climate change is much more than in other areas. And this is the commonality side between the two countries. And the second point I would like to make is about the security, the term security, because in the morning when we talk about the exclusive economic zone, and also I'm the policy guy and not a climate change guy. And I, for last almost 30 years, I'm doing the law of the sea studies. And in terms of security, and we have to take a caution that security in contemporary sense, including traditional security and non-traditional securities. So that means if we say that in the EEZ, in the exclusive economic zone, if there's no security rights, in terms of contemporary sense, it is not that precise. Because if we talk about energy security and environmental security, of course, the EEZ is very much relevant. The EEZ exclusive economic zone is just a name, but it has very much a lot of other implications in terms of security. That means if we take into account the meaning of non-security, non-traditional security, then we say that the security is much broader, and the meaning of security is much broader. And the third point I would like to make is about, because climate change is a very, very broad topic, and also climate change, if we concern the Earth, our planet is a global village, then the climate change will affect every aspect of our life, and also other animals on the Earth. And recently I attended a training course or in the staff development, and it's called environmental management. And the lecturer showed us a figure about the consumption, the life of our lifestyle. And according to her, and also there's a figure on the slide, and according to her, the lifestyle, current lifestyle of the United States, if the Earth, everybody on our Earth follows the American lifestyle or the living standard, then we need to use 4 Earths. And if we follow the lifestyle or the living standard of Western Europe, then we need 2.5 Earths. Then the China is just 1 Earth, and India is 3/4 Earth. So if we just, you can see that everybody now, even the developing countries now, it just follow the industrial road carried forward or designed by the Westerners. So if we follow that road forward into the future, I don't think the Earth can be sustainable. And then there will be pessimistically to say there will be a destruction and disaster to the human beings, also to the Earth we depend and we live. So this kind of reflections from the the presentation just now, and precisely to some kind of comments about the presentations. The first one is about, also the first one, the third one, that talk about cooperation between the two countries. And the first one is also talk about the Arctic Council and the U.S. Chairmanship next year. That draws me quite interest, because I'm wondering whether it is the U.S. Chairmanship can improve the collaboration or just deter the collaboration between the two countries, or between China and other countries in the Arctic Council. Because to me that at the present, the cooperation between China and the US in terms of Arctic is not that active than between China and Canada, and China and other Scandinavian countries. So this is a kind of thing. And the other thing is about, because many years ago I published an article about how to try to bring the Antarctic model to Arctic. So is that anything that Antarctic model can be applied to Arctic, or the Antarctic kind of Antarctic partially, or not if not wholly? And the second thing is about the financial arrangement. I skipped that. But one thing is related to the financial arrangement is about the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. And if we look at the climate change legal framework, and there's two groups. One is developed countries, and the other is developing countries. So the CDM is designed to, for the developed countries to assist in the developing countries. So to what extent that the financial arrangement and can facilitate the implementation of the CDM provided in the Climate Change Convention. And the other thing is about the regional arrangements in Asia Pacific. Of course, I appreciate that personally. And is there any possibility that we can use existing framework like the APEC? Can we use APEC to facilitate the regional arrangement for cooperation for the climate change and energy, clean energy? So for the Xinjun's paper is about the renewable energy law, and that's just one question is about, because in China, the energy sector is largely monopolized by state-owned enterprise. So you just mentioned the fixed price. So is it just designed to protect the enterprise, state-owned enterprises, rather than to improve energy efficiency? So this is, of course, the law is itself is, it was enacted in 2005, so this 10 years ago. So I don't know whether there's a room for further improvement. And for the Joanna's paper is about collaboration, and I appreciate that from her presentation we can hear a lot of joint projects, particularly the US-China Clean Energy Center, and bring the experts from the two sides for the research and development. That is very, very positive, very positive progress in terms of climate change matters. And finally, I would like to ask the whole panel about a few questions about just come to my mind. One is about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Particularly, I would like to ask two American colleagues, how do you understand, interpret the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities? And the second thing is about the precautionary approach, whether the precautionary approach can be fully realized in dealing with the climate change and the global warming. Thank you.
Many thanks for the questions. First on the Arctic, China only joined the Arctic Council as an observer nation about 1.5 years ago. So China's role is still very new. And the United States, a lot of US observers are waiting to figure out what will China do in the Arctic and what kind of partner, can China be a partner or will it be a competitive dynamic? China is still very new and in that area, and so it's undecided. My understanding is that it's undecided in most US foreign policy circles what a Chinese role is going to look like and if it will be something that will be collaborative with the United States. And I think through climate change, we have an opportunity to answer that question by saying China can be a strong, responsible power in the Arctic and bring good things to the table and cooperate closely with the United States and other Arctic nations. And you mentioned that China's had more cooperation with Canada. That's because Canada chairs the Arctic Council, but we'll hand that over to the US next week. So we'll see what happens starting next week. I think this is our grand opportunity to open up some xinxing cooperation between the United States and China in the Arctic. And China does have a growing presence in Scandinavian nations that do have energy resources. And that is, I understand why that presence is important from a Chinese perspective. I also think that presence has strategic risk, because if China's Arctic role is defined by searching for resources, then other countries are going to watch that action with some nervousness. So if China can take on some climate actions as well to show that China hopes to extract resources from the Arctic, but China also hopes to work with the rest of the global community to protect the Arctic. I think a train runs on 2 tracks. And if you have only 1 track, that can be very dangerous. But with 2 tracks, we can move towards something that could be a boon for US-China cooperation and China's rise more broadly. And you bring up the CDM, the transfer of finance and assistance from developed countries to developing countries. I see that as the old model framework. What we have now is that China is taking on a stronger role in recognizing that China is not a developed country, but China is not a poor country either. China is a middle-income country, and so the Chinese government has started a new South-South China Climate Fund that China will be using to provide assistance to countries that could use Chinese help and to help other nations follow China's model of sustainable development. And that is a very important breakthrough, to have China showing a leadership role on how rising developing nations can also be leaders on climate finance and reach out to their brothers and sisters that are further below them on the development ladder. We're moving into an area where it's not a black-white divide between developed and developing countries, but rather something more nuanced. And China is the leader in showing what that nuance can look like. And I'll leave it to my colleague Joanna to talk about what that looks like in terms of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. But my personal opinion is that we broke down some walls on CBDR when our 2 presidents met in November. That had always been an issue that divided the global community, with the developed countries on one side and the developing countries on the other. But after the US and Chinese presidents were able to work out a common agreement on how our nations could move past that, the rest of the 195 parties to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change borrowed the same language at the last big global climate meeting and were able to receive global progress as well. So I think that's an issue where the US and China are already leading the way past that wall. And so it's better to look forward than backward.
I'll be brief, because I'd like to also hear from the audience, but thank you for the questions. I think you hit on a lot of important topics, and I think the precautionary principle is something that there's actually language on precaution in the Framework Convention, and yet we use sort of scientific uncertainty still as an excuse for not acting on climate change. quite frequently, particularly in this country. And I think that, if we look to lessons from other more, successful cooperation examples in the international environmental sphere, like the Montreal Protocol, where we actually acted to address ozone depletion before the science was sort of fully clear. And so I think that's a really important model to look at even in this case. I think the question about how we can facilitate better regional cooperation on climate change and clean energy is very important. I was author of a chapter in the most recent IPCC report looking at that exact topic, and what we found is that there's a lot of really strong sort of instruments and regional alliances and not a lot of really constructive cooperation happening yet in this area. APEC, I think, is one exception, where there have been some very constructive outcomes, particularly in the trade space related to removing tariffs on trade and green goods. So I think this is something that could certainly be expanded. And then finally, on your question on the CDM and carbon markets, I think the future of the CDM is really quite unclear with sort of what will happen in Paris and where we sort of are if we're moving beyond the Kyoto Protocol. But I think that there's a lot of interest in keeping carbon markets sort of alive and well around the world, particularly because we have had some success stories, and this can be a cost-effective way to drive down emissions reductions. So I think there's a lot of actually interest in, as China designs its national carbon market, what the role might be of CDM-like measures, particularly offsets, domestic or international, because this will, if everything goes forward, will be the largest carbon market in the world by 2019. And so could be extremely influential, I think, in how market mechanisms are used for carbon in the coming years.
Reserved a considerable amount of time for questions. I have to just add one very brief comment on Arctic Council. My own experience is that this is not a strong institution. We heard earlier about the challenges of governance related to cyber issues and also those related to maritime security. This is a consensus organization, and what has been gained by China being an observer, which I think is a very positive thing, has perhaps been offset by the deteriorating relations between the West and Russia, which doesn't bode well necessarily for the Arctic Council, and I think there's a heightened risk of a military dimension being there that wasn't there to the same extent previously. I'd now like to invite questions from the floor. Please try and keep your questions short and identify yourself, please. And could we pass a mic to this gentleman, please?
Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Actually, I have three short questions to different people.
Please.
One on the one of the graphs that you showed, Joanna, had nuclear energy on it, and I would like to know something about how much going forward of the alternative to coal, nuclear would play versus wind and solar. And the other question is, I'm sure you can't answer, but the question for planners would be, how do we best use our dollars or our UN in investment in nuclear versus wind and solar if we're going to supply energy to this growing population? Secondly, also to Joanna, the issue of energy and water. What do you actually mean by that? Is that you have desalination where you use energy to desalinate water, or is it water transfer, as China is doing from the south to north? What is the relationship you see? I think we could learn some lessons in that in the United States, because what China is doing with their south to north project, we could have been doing in our north to south project 30 years ago under John Kennedy by bringing water down from the Arctic into California and into the Southwest. We didn't do that. We're suffering now, and California may be lost. You know, Governor Brown says we really only have enough room here for 300,000 people. And what is the population of California? 15 million or something like that. And there was one other question to Mr. Zhang. I don't know if he can answer it, but I saw a very interesting article coming out of the Chinese press of building a solar panel in space close to the sun. I thought that was interesting because scientists were thinking about this 30 years ago. My wife poo-pooed the idea because she says getting it from there to here is not going to be so easy, although it's very intense. It's a lot of energy, more so than we get here on Earth. Bringing it down here is not going to be easy. I was wondering, is that a project that's actually ongoing, or is that somebody's idea and got into the press somehow? Thank you.
panelists. Who would like to respond first? Please, Joanna.
Thank you for the questions. So briefly on your question on the role of nuclear, I mean, China, nuclear is a very small share of current electricity generation in China. The last data I saw shows that they actually get more electricity right now from wind energy than from nuclear. But going forward, China is planning to build more nuclear plants than any other country in terms of what you have on the books, in terms of projects sort of underway, either have broken ground or planning to be constructed in the next decade or two. So I think this is going to be an interesting sector to watch in China, and China sort of takes a all of the above approach, as we call it, on energy, because they need to look at sort of all the low emission, low carbon sources that are available, and nuclear being one. I think in terms of where sort of efforts are being concentrated, it does tend to be in parts of the country that don't tend to have other options in terms of, for example, in southeastern China, where you don't tend to have a lot of coal resources, hydro resources, and so you're looking for large baseload sources of energy in places that could be cost effective. I think the regulatory infrastructure is still being built and developed, and of course I know policymakers are sort of watching closely lessons learned in the U.S. and Japan and elsewhere. So I think it'll certainly be a large share going forward, but it'll take a long time to scale up. Your question on energy water, in terms of what this means, it's still being defined. This is a new announcement, and the RFP is sort of currently out for looking at different projects that might participate as part of this new consortium in the Clean Energy Research Center. But I think the types of projects which are being tossed around are things similar to what you mentioned, not so much water diversion projects, which tend to use a lot of energy to move a little bit of water, and sort of, this is happening on top of sort of other energy constraints and goals. So I think that the idea here is to actually look at ways to develop energy resources using water more efficiently, take into account water-stressed regions in planning for new fossil plants, new renewable plants, so that this can be done more holistically. There may be desal and other technologies. I've heard of some technologies trying to combine that with the carbon capture technologies and things like this, but I think this is still being defined.
Thank you. Other comments from the panel? If not, we'll go to the next question. President Wu, please. Oh, sorry. Please. First, we'll go to.
Thank you for the question. I don't know the project, but I think that you put forward the same issue, which means that the energy generator is one side. Another issue is whether or not the electricity generated by using renewable energy technology can be efficiently connected into the network for the ordinary use. So that is the Chinese law addressed the relations between the power grid companies and the energy power plants. So I think the same issue, and both of them difficult. And I think that project that you mentioned is more difficult than the law would suppose. And I would also like to add a little bit on the CDM. I agree with John. It's mostly, first, it doesn't apply in the U.S.-China cooperation in the field because U.S. is not part of the state. The second is quite unstable, the CDM project, on two things. First, the EB set some very specific methodology on deciding the eligibility of CDM. So renewable energy, for example, the hydropower sometimes is excluded. So that is put some difficulties on whether or not to incorporate CDM into the renewable energy sectors. The second is the uncertain future, the post-Kyoto, the second promise commitment period. We don't know whether or not the CERs can keep to be credited by the governments, by the other developed countries. So, and also on the precautionary principle and common but differentiated responsibility, two things I like. But my view is that both of them can hardly be seen as something as a positive rule of international law. Precautionary principle, I guess that in a lot of the law of the sea cases, and as well as the ICJ case, never been directly recognized as existing rule of customary international law. I remember the land reclamation case in between Singapore and Malaysia. Malaysia raised this issue, but the court, the ICAS avoids to address that issue. In my view, it's quite reasonable because in a normal laissez-faire society, a free competition, normally the responsibility from torts must be built on the relations of cause-effect. So if you don't have the cause-effect, no responsibility. That's something driving the society to move forward in the laissez-faire society. So if you give a precautionary principle, well, some people must be mad, in my view. But in the meantime, the common but differentiated responsibility, I still guess it is at most being called as an emerging rule of whatsoever. But still, we need to take the three principles is incorporated in the Kyoto Protocol as well as the UNFCCC is a precautionary principle, common but differentiated responsibility, and sustainable development. My view is maybe they are all not positive rules. They may be emerging rules, but you have to keep it as a whole. You cannot just, ignore one. For example, common but differentiate responsibility, but emphasize the other. That will totally destroy the balance that we built in UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. President Wu.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. Actually, my question is, you just mentioned in your remarks that when U.S. Takes over the chairmanship of Arctic Council, there would be both competition and cooperation between China and the United States in the Arctic area. Would you please figure out, given that, in my perspective, China has its interests in the Arctic in such areas as geopolitical consideration, sea land communication, and natural resources, and marine scientific research. So would you please figure out in what areas that China and the United States would compete each other in the future, given that if we look at the situation in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, things are getting complicated with the U.S. involvement. Thank you.
That's a great question. So I was a little bit surprised when I first started sharing the idea of doing something together with China in the Arctic Council. In the climate community, people thought that makes perfect sense. In the security community, people were not so sure. And that is because there are some public reports available that you can read that can explain how some American security experts are watching China's growing Arctic role and viewing that as a potential threat. And it's primarily focused on resource extraction and how China might approach some of the sea lanes of communication. I think, the United States, my personal individual opinion is that the United States is still trying to figure out how to really welcome China's new roles as a rising power. We know that we welcome a rising China, and a rising, strong China is good for American interests, but sometimes when China is acting as a rising power, it makes us very nervous. I think the very recent example is AIIB. That was, in my opinion, that was a nervous reaction. And my personal opinion is that we see a risk of a similar nervous reaction to China's growing role in the Arctic. You know, there are many American observers that think China's spending more time in the Arctic. That must be a very dangerous thing. How do we push them out? You know, and I think that's a dangerous dynamic. You know, people tend to connect issue areas. So, you know, some thinkers might see that it's been very difficult to find commonalities in the South China Sea, in Asia-Pacific maritime areas. And some thinkers might say, if China is moving into the Arctic, that means we'll have the same thing, you know, in another part of the world. So how do we prepare for that? I encourage you to read some of the public reports out there that go into great detail and for the ways in which this could be a risk to the United States. And I viewed those reports as just the, you know, showing how some people are thinking and how some people are reacting to China's initial expanded role. And I think it's a US responsibility and a Chinese responsibility to change that dynamic. You know, from a US perspective, we need to do a better job at thinking about how can we change the status quo, give China a stronger role in a way that doesn't terrify us, in a way that furthers our own goals as well. And from a Chinese perspective, I see a Chinese responsibility to think strategically about, as we expand the role, how do we help people understand that that expansion can be good for them too? It can be good for the United States too. And I see climate change cooperation as a way to do that in many areas outside of the traditional climate space. And so, you know, just for example, in the Arctic, all you hear about China in the Arctic is resource extraction, building things in Iceland, and moving ships, you know, through maritime supply lanes. And all of those things can make a lot of people nervous. But if the biggest China Arctic story is a story about China saving the Arctic, you know, and working with the United States to lead other nations to reduce black carbon emissions, reduce methane emissions, slow the rate of sea ice melt, that to me is a much better story. And that would be a much better introduction of China onto the global world order than if the introduction is only about China going after more oil and gas resources.
Thank you, Mina. If we move quickly, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Maybe we'll do this sort of rapid fire. So if you could compress your question, and we'll compress the answers, please, at this time. Thank you.
All right, compressed question is, shale oil and gas revolution in the United States has changed the landscape. Will be a net, we will not have any, 2020 will be equal in imports and exports. Where are the opportunities for China and US-China cooperation with respect to shale oil and gas development? That's compressed.
Thank you. To the panel.
So the United States shale gas revolution is a result of the US market structure, which is very open and transparent. Here in the United States, all types of private companies can participate in shale development. You know, shale development is very technically complex, so our big oil and gas companies can't do any drilling operations alone. They invite specialized firms to do individual pieces of the operation. It works because we have an open market with transparent information about geological data. In China, the geological data is a state secret. So it's very hard to figure out how much shale oil and gas China actually has. It's very hard for American firms to figure out whether it's a good idea to assist Chinese companies with development. It's hard to figure out what that would require, what kind of technology would be useful. China also has strict controls over how the gas plays are auctioned off. Currently, China's state-owned oil companies control most of the oil and gas plays, particularly the good ones, and there's a limited role for foreign company participation. So I speak with American oil companies about this particular issue and whether they should go into China and partner with Chinese companies on shale gas development. Most of the companies I speak to are pretty negative right now, simply because they don't think that the market structure is one that allows foreign companies to make a profit. I'm hoping to see change in that. I know the Chinese government is already working very hard to marketize natural gas prices in China. That is a humongous development. It's very big news, and it's something we don't pay enough attention to in the United States. So as that moves forward, I expect we might see more and more opening up as that sector, and it might become a new opportunity for U.S. to do more sharing and more help and more participation, with the understanding that the companies who do that can actually make a profit.
And I would like to add a few words, please.
Sure, I'll make a quick addition. So I think, in terms of operationalizing that into maybe how we could cooperate, sort of two things jump out to me. One is around the sort of the data sharing transparency issue. I think that there's a lot of room there for sort of cooperating even among geologists and sort of more on the technical side to look at actual deposits and reserves. And then second, I think that this is sort of a related area, but doesn't always get talked about. But in the context of power sector reform, China uses very little natural gas right now for electricity. But there's a huge, I think, demand for really scaling that up, and could have, as in this country, a really positive net benefit for greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that as you're looking at sort of more price competition within the power sector and more market sort of reforms, this could actually open up more access, drive down the costs, particularly of sort of competing fuels, and that could be an important area for moving natural gas sort of out of select industrial sectors and more into mainstream power supply.
I wonder if you can discuss briefly the role you expect China to play in Paris, especially in view or in contrast to the role it played in Copenhagen.
I'm happy to start, and I'd welcome my panelists to comment as well, because I'm sure they have thoughts. But I think that the November announcement, which I spoke about, is really the most constructive sign we've seen recently in terms of stepping out into the international community and sending a positive signal, not to the United States, but also to the entire rest of the world, and particularly the other sort of emerging economies, which are going to be so crucial in not just curbing future greenhouse gas emissions, but in the politics of the Paris summit. I think we already see a lot of nations starting to follow suit. I was in Lima in December, so just a couple weeks after the US-China announcement, and all you heard all the other countries talking about was, well, first of all, how somewhat surprised they were by the announcement, but what this meant for India, for Mexico, for Brazil, for a lot of the other key players, and I think it's been nothing but constructive. You saw an announcement followed a few weeks ago from Mexico in the United States. You may see other bilateral announcements, countries coming forward, again, trying to sort of keep momentum going between now and Paris. And so I think that you do see a different role there. I think that I've heard very good things about the new head of the Chinese climate delegation, also being very constructive in this area, and so I think that this is going to be very different from Copenhagen. One of the big differences, the bilateral relationship was quite different in 2009. It was new in the energy and climate space. I showed you a long list of agreements we've signed in just those last 5-6 years, and so I think that the politics are different, and this could really spill over into the international dynamic.
Are others from the panel who'd like to comment on that?
I just add one point, brief point. It's about the change of the Chinese government position. In my personal opinion, it seems to me that according to the Kyoto protocol arrangement, the developing countries, they're exempted from the reduction targets. So now after November announcement, it seemed to me that Chinese government, the position changed. They tended to receive some kind of arrangement about the reduction targets. So this is a quite fundamental change. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Just to add to that briefly, I think what China did was, as you said, be the first developing country to step forward in a very big way, in a very high-profile way, and now everyone else is trying to figure out how not to look bad next to China, and that's a fantastic dynamic. I really applaud that type of leadership role, and at the moment, I'm feeling pretty good that we're going to have a wonderful outcome in December, and hopefully maybe even new things announced when Xi Jinping comes to the United States in September.
Naval War College. How can we do a better job in leveraging things like the November announcement to get the word out that there's good news in the U.S.-China relations in this area. You know, bad news leads. We hear about the trade war. We don't hear, this group, of course, has the panel here has the expertise and is in the climate change and clean energy community. But for the rest of people, you know, all you hear is about, you know, solar panel trade disputes or other negative things like Dr. Hart cited on Arctic type of stuff. It seems to me there's a good story to be told here through the research center with agreed intellectual property projects and in U.S.-China cooperation to really lead the world forward. But, you know, all you hear is China's far surpassed us in dumping pollution in the air. Another thing, not surprising with 4 times the population and developed now, but it just seems that, you know, one thing we ought to think about is to tell the story when we've got good news if our purpose is U.S.-China cooperation.
Here, and if there are not further questions, yes, we have the last question to this table, please.
Just a quick comment, not even necessarily a question, but thank you. I'm not sure it's a question, but I was provoked by your comment that there is a relationship between Russia and the U.S. that may cast a bit of a chill on the upcoming meetings of the Arctic Council. I just want to mention that 70% of the Arctic is controlled by Russia. And I think irrespective of any bilateral problems, their attitude on climate change and energy policy may not be as forthcoming as I think all of us in this room would like to see. So I'm not sure it's a question, but if anyone else is provoked to comment on that, happy.
Thank you very much. And that may be a bit of cold water on what has been actually a very warm water experience, I think, from the last question. And I said it would be the last, but I'm going to have one final comment or quick question from that table, please.
Thank you very much. I want to fully echo what Professor Nordquist has mentioned. That question is about for Ms. Hart. I'm very curious about you said that there is competition about China and the U.S. in the Arctic because China fully recognizes the sovereignty and the sovereign rights of the states neighboring in the Arctic region. So all the resources, most of them in EEZs. China have none of the EEZ in the Arctic. So it's very curious for me to ask, what kind of resources do you think China will want from the Arctic? At the same time, China wants to contribute at those areas you mentioned, which have the beyond the region issues, like the climate change, like transportation. So I just want your information and also your response. Thank you.
Sure. So regarding Russia, you know, this is the very nice thing about climate change. You know, if all of the member nation, observer nations, except for Russia, make some voluntary commitments to reduce black carbon and methane emissions, that's still great progress. You know, we don't have to let the Russians hold us back on making progress in the Arctic. And maybe that would be a great pressure to try to get them to join the same kind of progress. You know, so that's the wonderful thing about some of the voluntary climate commitments, right? So if countries decide, the US and China, by consensus, voluntarily, the two of them stepped forward ahead of the pack and made a joint announcement that broke apart a many-year standing divide and is likely to make possible a groundbreaking climate agreement that will involve nearly 200 other nations. You know, I think what the US and Chinese leaders have figured out, that we don't have to sit around and wait until all of the countries that have a seat at the table have an agreement on something binding. You know, we can find innovative ways to step forward together. And sometimes, you know, the optics are just as important as the process mechanisms for breaking forward, you know, new opportunities for cooperation. And, you know, as regarding what makes people nervous about China's role in the Arctic, you know, welcome to the life of a great power. You know, when you move, people will get nervous. The US has to deal with that as well. And anytime, I think we're now in the era that anytime China expands its presence and makes forward-pushing actions, global citizens will get nervous. And so, I view it as China's responsibility to look for ways to reassure and communicate about what China's intentions are. And again, what we saw, my biggest lesson from the joint announcement in November is that sometimes it takes some big international framing to help people understand what it is you're really doing already. I found it so interesting. One of my biggest responsibilities at my institution is to educate people in Washington about what China's doing on energy and climate policy. And immediately after the joint announcement, people were begging me to come to their offices and tell them the same thing I was telling them a few months before, but suddenly it was shocking information because it's now tied to this international commitment. And I think China's going to see the same thing in other areas as well. What you're doing already domestically sometimes just needs a bigger, grander package to help the international observers understand what your real interests and incentives are. And I see an opportunity to do a bigger, grander package in the Arctic. And I do see a risk right now that what Chinese government officials might perceive as small, non-threatening things, if you pay attention to public reports in the United States, the perception on this side is a little bit different. And so it might be wise to look for ways to package that and pair that with other actions that will help communicate more accurately to an American audience what exactly China's intentions are. Because I fundamentally believe that those intentions are probably not contra to the interests of the United States. We just need better communication and coordination on that regard.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And could you please join me in thanking our panelists? I'd also like to thank the audience for their stimulating questions.
I think we have time to take a full 15-minute break, so we can convene the final panel at